We need to talk. Seraphina's voice cut through the silence like a verdict, and Alistair's heart already knew. This was the moment everything would change. She closed his office door with a quiet click, her arms crossed, everything about her screaming protection. Guarded eyes. The jasmine scent he'd been drowning in for 6 weeks now, mixed with something sharper. Hurt, maybe. Or resolve. About what? He kept his tone professional, even though his pulse was racing, even though he'd spent the last hour watching her through glass like a man starving. About the way you look at me when you think I don't notice. She stepped closer, and the air between them crackled. About the way you find excuses to keep me late. About this thing between us that you refuse to name. His throat went dry. I don't know what you're... Don't. The word cut clean. I've spent my entire life reading rooms, Alistair. Reading men who want me, but won't admit it, because admitting it would cost them something they're not willing to pay. She pulled an envelope from her jacket, placed it on his desk with devastating care. I'm resigning. The words hit like a gunshot. And in that moment, Alistair Thorne, the billionaire who controlled everything, who'd built an empire on rules and precision, realized he was about to lose the only thing that had ever made him feel alive. But this story didn't start here. It started 6 weeks earlier, when a woman in a lavender dress walked into his sterile office and proved that some rules were meant to be shattered. Alistair Thorne's office was a monument to absence. No photographs, no trinkets. Nothing that could betray warmth or weakness. Matte black shelves lined walls the color of winter fog, and a silver clock ticked with the steady, robotic precision of a heartbeat that had forgotten how to skip. Everything in his world had its place, its function, its acceptable parameters. Even the people, especially the people. His mother had taught him that power wore tailored suits and sharp jawlines, that success smelled like bergamot cologne and tasted like mineral water from Italian glass. She had given him a singular definition of presentable, and he had built an empire on it. Taylor Tech, the fortress where he reigned as the war general of venture capital, where every hire, every handshake, every decision reinforced his carefully constructed brand. Control was oxygen. Predictability was peace. Until the door opened at 9:47 a.m. on a Tuesday that should have been like any other. Seraphina Cole stepped into his office wearing a lavender dress that caught the light like a challenge, her dark curls framing a face that seemed to hold both confidence and secrets. She moved with the kind of grace that didn't apologize for taking up space, her curves a rebellion against every professional standard his world had ever whispered. Alistair's fingers froze over his keyboard. The air shifted, became thicker, warmer, charged with something his sterile sanctuary had never contained. He looked up, ready to dismiss whatever HR had sent him, ready to return to the comfort of his controlled universe. But fire wrapped in silk doesn't ask for permission. And the man who had spent 42 years building walls suddenly found himself staring at the woman who would teach him they were really just a prison. She didn't wait for permission to sit. That was the first violation. Seraphina crossed the expanse of his office with the kind of certainty that made the space feel smaller, more intimate, as though she'd redrawn the boundaries with each step. Her lavender dress whispered against her thighs, a soft sound that seemed obscenely loud in the cathedral silence he'd cultivated. When she lowered herself into the leather chair across from his desk, the movement was fluid, unhurried. A woman who had never learned to make herself smaller for anyone's comfort. Alistair's jaw tightened. His eyes betrayed him, tracking the way light played across her mocha skin. How her curves created their own architecture against the geometric rigidity of his office. Everything about her was wrong for this space. Too warm, too alive, too much. Mr. Thorne? Her voice was honey poured over steel. Thank you for seeing me. He hadn't agreed to see her. His assistant had simply appeared in his doorway that morning with a resume and a nervous smile, explaining that HR had insisted, that the board had recommended, that this candidate was exceptional and exactly what the executive suite needed. What his executive suite needed was order. What it needed was people who understood that fitting in meant disappearing into the monochrome, becoming interchangeable parts in his well-oiled machine. Ms. Cole? He forced his gaze to his computer screen, where her credentials glowed in neat, sterile rows. Columbia MBA. 10 years at competing firms. Impeccable references. On paper, she was perfect. In person, she was chaos. I've reviewed your background. He kept his voice flat, clinical. Your experience is impressive. But? She tilted her head, and one of those dark curls fell across her shoulder, drawing his attention to the elegant line of her neck. He cleared his throat. But Taylor Tech has a very specific culture. We value precision, discretion, and conformity? The word landed soft, almost playful, but her eyes held challenge. Consistency, he corrected, feeling heat climb his collar. When had this office become so warm? We have standards. I can see that. Her gaze swept the room, taking in the black shelves, the gray walls, the absence of anything resembling personality. When she looked back at him, something flickered in her expression. Not judgment, but understanding, which somehow felt worse. Very sterile, very safe. The word safe shouldn't have felt like an insult, but from her lips, with that slight curve of amusement, it landed like a diagnosis. Alistair stood abruptly, needing distance, needing air, needing her not to look at him like she could see every rule he'd ever built between himself and the messy, unpredictable world. He moved to the window, pressing his palms against the cool glass, watching the city sprawl 40 stories below. The position requires someone who can integrate seamlessly into our existing structure, he said to his reflection, to the skyline, to anyone but her. Behind him, he heard her rise, heard the whisper of fabric, the soft click of heels on marble. Then she was beside him, close enough that he could smell jasmine and something else. Vanilla, maybe, or simply warmth. Mr. Thorne, she said quietly, I didn't come here to integrate. I came here to excel. And there it was, the disruption he'd sensed the moment she walked in. The confirmation that this woman, with her lavender dress and her unapologetic presence, was about to dismantle everything he thought he knew about control. He gave her 2 weeks, 14 days to prove she didn't belong, to make the mistake that would justify the termination letter already drafted in his mind. Day 1, she reorganized the entire project management system he'd spent 3 years perfecting. He'd arrived at 7 a.m. to find her already at her desk, fingers flying across her keyboard, 3 monitors glowing with spreadsheets that made his look primitive. When he'd demanded an explanation, she'd simply turned one screen toward him, showing him how she'd cut his quarterly reporting time by 40%. I assumed efficiency mattered more than tradition, she'd said, those dark eyes steady on his. He'd walked away without responding, because what could he say? That he preferred his inefficient system because at least it was his? Day 3, she closed the Meridian deal. The tech conglomerate had been circling for 6 months, never quite committing, always finding reasons to delay. Serafina had spent 90 minutes on a video call, and by the time she'd emerged from the conference room, the contract was signed. $12 million in revenue, locked in before lunch. His COO had actually applauded in the hallway. By day 7, Alistair was watching her the way a general studies an advancing army, looking for weaknesses, vulnerabilities, any crack in her armor that would give him permission to do what his instincts screamed at him to do. Remove her before she infected his entire operation with her particular brand of chaos. But she was never late, never flustered, never anything less than devastatingly competent. She arrived before him and left after him, her desk always immaculate except for a single framed photo, a woman who had her smile, probably her mother, and a small succulent that somehow thrived despite the office's lifeless air. Day 10, he invented a crisis. The Singapore investors were threatening to pull out, he told her, handing her a file thick with deliberately incomplete information. Fix it by morning, or we lose everything. She'd looked at him for a long moment, and he'd seen it. the flicker of recognition that this was a test, a trap, but she'd simply taken the file, nodded once, and said, "Consider it done." At 4 a.m., his phone had buzzed. A single email, elegant and surgical, outlining not just a solution, but 3 alternatives, each with projected outcomes and risk assessments. The Singapore investors weren't threatening to pull out. She'd discovered they were actually positioning to double their stake, and she'd negotiated terms that would net Taylor Tech an additional $8 million. She'd seen through his manufactured crisis and turned it into profit. When he'd arrived at the office that morning, she was there, looking fresh in a cream blouse that made her skin glow like polished bronze, a cup of coffee cooling on her desk. "The Singapore situation is resolved," she'd said without looking up from her screen. "I've also taken the liberty of auditing our other international accounts. You have 2 more investors playing similar games. Would you like me to handle those as well, or would you prefer to keep testing me?" Her tone was professional. Her eyes were not. Alistair had stood there, his carefully constructed reasons for firing her dissolving like sugar in rain, and realized with dawning horror that his problem was no longer about finding a reason to let her go. His problem was finding a reason that had nothing to do with the fact that every time she walked past his office, the air changed, and he forgot how to breathe. The crisis arrived on a Thursday at 3 p.m., dressed in legalese and catastrophic projections. Patterson Industries, Taylor Tech's largest client, was threatening breach of contract over a security flaw their team swore didn't exist. $28 million in annual revenue, hanging by a thread that was fraying in real time. Alistair's office became a war room. His team crowded around the conference table, voices overlapping in controlled panic, everyone talking and no one listening. The clock ticked louder with each passing minute. 4 hours until Patterson's board meeting. 4 hours to save an account that represented 18% of their annual revenue. His chest tightened. The air became thin, insufficient. He stood at the head of the table, hands braced against polished wood, and felt his carefully constructed control slipping like sand through his fingers. Then Serafina's hand touched his elbow. Light. Brief. Gone before anyone else noticed. "Mr. Thorne," she said quietly, "a word?" He wanted to snap at her, to demand she contribute something useful instead of interrupting, but something in her voice, that calm, that certainty, made him follow her into the hallway. She closed the door behind them, muffling the chaos. The silence felt like water closing over his head. "You're not breathing," she said. "I'm fine." But his voice came out rough, strangled. "You're not." She stepped closer, and he caught that jasmine scent again, warm and grounding. "Look at me." He did, because refusing felt like admitting weakness, and what he saw in her eyes wasn't pity. It was recognition. "4 counts in," she said. "Hold for 4, out for 4, with me." "I don't have time for—" "You don't have time to pass out in front of your team." Her voice remained soft, but steel ran through it. "Breathe, Alistair." His name. She'd never used his name before. It landed like a hand pulling him back from an edge he hadn't realized he was standing on. He breathed. 4 counts. Her hand rose to hover near his chest, not touching, just marking the rhythm. 4 counts. His lungs expanded. 4 counts. The hallway stopped tilting. "Better?" she asked after the 3rd cycle. He nodded, not trusting his voice. "I grew up in rooms that wanted me invisible," she said, still holding his gaze. "Boardrooms where men looked through me like I was glass. Spaces built to make me smaller, quieter, less." Her chin lifted. "So I learned to breathe through storms, to stand taller when they expected me to bend." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you've spent your whole life building walls to keep the storm out." She stepped back, creating distance but leaving warmth in its wake. "But some storms, Alistair, you have to walk through. And you can't do that if you're not breathing." She turned toward his office door, then paused. "The Patterson issue isn't a security flaw. It's a competitor planting evidence to steal your client. I found the source code injection 30 minutes ago. Give me 10 minutes with their CTO, and this storm ends. He watched her walk back into the war room, shoulders straight, head high, every inch of her refusing to shrink for anyone. And he realized she hadn't just taught him how to breathe. She'd shown him what it looked like to be unafraid of your own softness in a world built for armor. 3 weeks became 4. 4 became 6. And somewhere between the breathing lesson in the hallway and the morning he found himself arriving at the office 30 minutes early, just to catch the moment she walked through the door, Alistair stopped lying to himself about what was happening. He wasn't watching her to find faults anymore. He was watching her because the alternative, not watching her, had become impossible. It started small, the way she tucked a curl behind her ear when she was thinking. How her laugh, when it finally emerged during a team meeting, sounded like something expensive breaking in the best possible way. The precise angle of her head when she listened, really listened, making whoever spoke feel like the only person in the room. He noticed that she took her coffee black, that she kicked off her heels under her desk when she thought no one was looking, that she had a small scar on her left hand shaped like a crescent moon. He noticed everything, and the noticing was starting to hurt. His assistant had stopped asking if he wanted his door closed during Serafina's presentations. His COO had started giving him knowing looks during meetings where Serafina spoke, and Alistair's attention never wavered. Even Marcus from accounting had made a joke about productivity through inspiration that Alistair had pretended not to understand. But he understood. God help him, he understood. The civil war inside him waged itself in boardrooms and break rooms, in the space between professional distance and the gravitational pull that made him find excuses to walk past her desk, to ask her opinion on deals that didn't need her input, to keep her late discussing strategies that could have waited until morning. His mother's voice echoed in his skull during every interaction. Maintain standards, Alistair. A man of your position cannot afford distractions, especially not those kinds of distractions. Those kinds. He'd known what she meant. Women who looked like Serafina, too curvy, too vibrant, too much of everything his world labeled as unprofessional. His mother had trained him to see them as weaknesses disguised as temptation, as threats to the polished image he'd spent his life constructing. But Serafina wasn't a threat. She was an earthquake, and he was tired of pretending the ground beneath his feet wasn't already cracked. Friday evening, past 8, most of the office dark except for their 2 islands of light. He stood at his window, pretending to review contracts, actually watching her reflection in the glass. She'd changed into flats, her blazer draped over her chair, and she was writing something longhand in a leather journal, her expression soft and unguarded, in a way she never allowed during business hours. Beautiful. The word surfaced before he could stop it. Not professionally attractive, not appropriately presentable. Just beautiful, in a way that made his chest ache with wants he'd never given himself permission to feel. She looked up suddenly, catching his reflection watching hers. For a moment, neither moved. The glass between them felt both infinite and non-existent. Then she smiled, small, sad, knowing, and returned to her journal. And Alistair understood with devastating clarity that he'd already lost this war. The only question remaining was whether he had the courage to surrender, or if he'd let his mother's ghost and his own cowardice cost him the first real thing he'd felt in 42 years of perfectly controlled emptiness. She came to his office after everyone else had left, closing the door with a quiet click that sounded like a verdict. "We need to talk," Serafina said, and her voice carried none of its usual warmth. Alistair looked up from his laptop, his heart already racing. She stood in the doorway wearing navy blue, her arms crossed, and everything about her body language screamed protection. "About what?" He kept his tone neutral, professional, as if the past 6 weeks hadn't happened, as if he hadn't spent the last hour watching her through glass like a man starving. "About the way you look at me when you think I don't notice." She stepped into the room, and he caught jasmine mixed with something sharper. Hurt, maybe, or resolve. About the way you find excuses to keep me late, to ask questions you already know the answers to, about this thing between us that you refuse to name. His throat went dry. I don't know what you're. Don't. The word cut clean. I've spent my entire life reading rooms, Alistair. Reading men who want me, but won't admit it, because admitting it would cost them something they're not willing to pay. So please don't insult me by pretending you don't feel this. He stood, needing movement, needing distance. But she didn't retreat. She planted herself in front of his desk like she was claiming territory in a war neither of them wanted. What do you want me to say? His voice came out rough. I want you to be honest. Her eyes searched his face. Tell me I'm wrong. Tell me I've misread every lingering look, every excuse to be near me, every moment you've looked at me like I'm oxygen and you're drowning. He couldn't. The words wouldn't come because they would be lies, and she deserved better than his cowardice dressed up as professionalism. I thought so. She nodded slowly, and something in her expression cracked. But here's the thing, Alistair. I won't be your secret. I won't be the woman you want in private, but can't acknowledge in public, because she doesn't fit your mother's definition of acceptable. I won't shrink myself to fit into your sterile world just so you can pretend you're not breaking your own rules. Serafina, I'm resigning. She pulled an envelope from her jacket, placed it on his desk, with the care of someone handling something precious and fragile. Effective 2 weeks from today. That should give you time to find someone more suitable, someone who fits your standards. The words hit like physical blows. You can't. I can, and I am. Her voice softened, and that somehow made it worse. Because I deserve someone who isn't afraid of wanting me. Someone who sees curves and fire and doesn't immediately calculate the professional risk. Someone who doesn't need 2 months to decide if I'm worth disrupting his perfectly ordered life. She moved toward the door, and panic clawed up his throat. What if I... He stopped. The words tangling with everything his mother had taught him, with 42 years of rules that suddenly felt like chains. She paused, hand on the doorframe, waiting, giving him one last chance to be brave. But the silence stretched too long, and when she looked back at him, her smile was gentle and absolutely devastating. That's what I thought, she whispered. Goodbye, Alistair. The door closed. The office returned to its sterile silence. And Alistair stood among his black shelves, and his silver clock, and his perfectly controlled emptiness, understanding too late that some lines, once uncrossed, leave you stranded on the wrong side of everything that matters. The first day after she left, he convinced himself it was relief. His office returned to its proper order. No lavender disrupting the monochrome. No jasmine scent lingering in the hallway. No one to make him question 42 years of carefully constructed walls. By day 3, relief had curdled into something else. The silence that had once felt like peace now pressed against his eardrums like deep water. His assistant brought coffee at precisely 8 a.m., and he couldn't remember if Serafina had taken sugar or not, couldn't remember if she'd hummed softly while working, or if he'd imagined that detail in his desperation to know her. He'd hired someone new, competent, efficient, forgettable, a man in a gray suit who answered emails promptly and never made the air shift when he entered a room. Exactly what Alistair had always wanted. It felt like dying slowly. The Meridian account sent flowers thanking Taylor Tech for exceptional service. He stared at the arrangement, white orchids, pristine and soulless, and remembered how Serafina had kept that small succulent on her desk, something alive in his mausoleum of an office. He'd thrown the orchids away before lunch. By week 2, his COO pulled him aside. You look like hell, Thorne. When's the last time you slept? He didn't answer, because he couldn't explain that sleep meant dreams where she walked through his door in that lavender dress, where he said all the things his cowardice had swallowed, where he was brave enough to choose her over his mother's ghost. He caught himself walking past her old desk, expecting to see her there, fingers flying across the keyboard, that small crescent scar catching light. But it was empty now, sterile, as if she'd never existed. As if she hadn't spent 6 weeks proving that every rule he'd built his life around was just fear dressed up as standards. The Patterson deal fell through. Singapore investors delayed their expansion. 3 clients requested meetings to reassess the relationship. His empire, built on precision and control, was crumbling at the edges, and Alistair understood with sickening clarity that Serafina hadn't just been efficient. She'd been the oxygen, and he'd been suffocating for 42 years without realizing it until she'd taught him how to breathe, then left him gasping in the wreckage of his own making. He found himself at her LinkedIn profile at 2 a.m. on a Thursday, staring at her professional photo, memorizing the angle of her chin, the confidence in her eyes. She'd changed her status. Open to new opportunities. As if Taylor Tech had been just another line on her resume. As if he hadn't been drowning in her absence while she moved forward with her life. The jealousy that thought inspired was irrational and consuming. His phone buzzed with an invitation. Some tech gala, the kind of networking event he usually delegated. But her name was on the speaker list, and he'd clicked attending before rational thought could intervene. Because she hadn't just gotten under his skin. She'd rewritten it entirely, changed the code of who he was until the man he'd been before her, controlled, certain, safe, felt like a stranger he could barely recognize. And the man he'd become in her absence felt like a tomb, silent and cold, where something vital had been buried alive. The ballroom glittered with Manhattan's tech elite, all sharp suits and sharper ambitions, networking over champagne that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Alistair stood near the bar, nursing scotch he couldn't taste, scanning the crowd for a woman he had no right to seek. Then the lights dimmed, and she appeared on stage. Serafina wore emerald green, the dress clinging to every curve his mother would have called inappropriate, her dark curls swept over one shoulder in a style that was both elegant and deliberately untamed. She commanded the podium like she'd been born for it, and when she spoke, the entire room leaned forward. "We talk about disruption like it's a business strategy," she began, her voice filling the space with that honey and steel combination he'd heard in his dreams for 3 weeks straight. But real disruption isn't about technology. It's about having the courage to rewrite the rules that no longer serve us. Alistair's chest constricted. She wasn't looking at him, couldn't possibly know he was there in the back, half hidden by a marble column. But every word felt aimed at the space between his ribs. "I spent years making myself smaller to fit into rooms that were never designed for me," she continued, softening my voice, straightening my hair, wearing beige when I wanted to wear red, believing that success meant becoming invisible, becoming acceptable. The audience was silent, captivated, but Alistair only saw her, the way she stood taller with each word, how her hands moved with passionate precision, the fire in her eyes that no amount of professional polish could dim. Then I realized something. She paused, and her smile held both pain and power. The rooms that required me to shrink weren't worth the price of admission, so I started building my own rooms, spaces where curves aren't threats, where fire isn't something to extinguish, but something to celebrate, where being unapologetically yourself isn't rebellion, it's revolution. The applause erupted, but Alistair couldn't move. He stood frozen, watching her accept congratulations from executives who'd probably spent years underestimating her, watching her smile and shake hands and shine like she'd never needed his sterile office or his conditional approval. She'd built her own room, and he'd locked himself in his tomb, pretending it was a castle. A venture capitalist from Boston approached her, leaning too close, saying something that made her laugh. Alistair's hand tightened around his glass. That laugh, bright and genuine, and nothing like the careful professional courtesy she'd given him, felt like witnessing something he'd lost before he'd ever truly had it. He'd wanted her to fit, to integrate seamlessly into his world, to be fire that didn't burn, to be disruption that didn't actually disrupt anything important. He'd wanted a version of her that wouldn't cost him his comfort, his control, his mother's approval. But standing in this ballroom, watching her claim space with such absolute certainty, Alistair finally understood the magnitude of his mistake. He didn't want a version of Serafina. He wanted all of her. The fire, the curves, The jasmine and steel, the way she refused to shrink for anyone. He wanted the disruption, the revolution, the complete demolition of every rule that had kept him safe and suffocated for 42 years. He wanted her entire fire, even if it meant burning down everything he'd built to keep it at bay. The question was whether he'd already lost his chance to warm himself by it, or if courage, however late, could still rewrite an ending he'd been too afraid to deserve. She almost didn't come. He'd sent the text at midnight after the gala, his hands shaking like a teenager's, asking if she'd meet him at his house in the Hamptons. No pretense of business, no professional distance, just a plea wrapped in longitude and latitude coordinates and the words, "I need to tell you the truth." Her response came 3 hours later. A single word. When? Saturday morning found him on the weathered deck of the beach house his mother had never approved of. Too casual, too exposed, too much glass, and not enough walls. He'd bought it anyway, then barely visited it, as if even his rebellion had to be theoretical. Serafina arrived in jeans and a cream sweater, her hair loose and curling in the salt air, and she looked so beautiful it hurt to breathe. She stopped at the edge of the deck, maintaining careful distance, her expression guarded. "You said you had something to tell me." Alistair looked down at his bare feet against the sun-bleached wood. The first time in his adult life he'd stood before anyone without armor. No suit, no office, no rules to hide behind. "My mother died when I was 23, he began, voice rough with disuse. This story had never been told before. But before she did, she spent 23 years teaching me exactly who I was allowed to be, who I was allowed to want. Serafina's expression softened slightly, but she didn't move closer. She'd been a secretary who married the CEO, spent her whole life proving she deserved her place in rooms that looked down on her, so she raised me to never make her mistake, never want someone who'd make people question my polish, my brand, my right to power. He forced himself to meet Serafina's eyes. She taught me that women like you were beautiful but dangerous. Fire that would burn everything I'd built. Women like me? Not a question, a challenge. Women with curves and confidence. Women who took up space instead of apologizing for it. Women who didn't need to straighten themselves to fit into someone else's definition of acceptable. His throat tightened. She taught me to fear the very thing The words caught. The very thing I love. The ocean crashed against the shore, filling the silence that followed. "You love me?" Serafina's voice carried equal parts disbelief and hurt. "I've loved you since you walked into my office and refused to wait for permission to sit down." The confession came easier now, like oxygen returning to starved lungs. "Since you taught me how to breathe during a storm. Since you looked at my sterile world and called it what it was. Safe. A tomb I'd been living in for so long I'd forgotten what it felt like to be alive." He took one step toward her, then stopped, giving her control of the space between them. "I was a coward, Serafina. I let my dead mother's fears cost me the only real thing I've felt in 42 years. And I know I have no right to ask this, but—" His voice cracked. "But I'm standing here barefoot and terrified, asking if there's any chance you'd consider teaching a man who's been afraid his whole life what it means to be brave." She stood there, the wind catching her hair, her eyes searching his face for lies she wouldn't find. And Alistair understood that some truths, however raw, were the only foundation worth building on. A year later, Alistair Thorne stood in the same spot on that weathered deck, barefoot again, but no longer afraid. The ocean rolled beneath an October sunset, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, and he waited for Serafina to finish the phone call that had pulled her inside. 12 months of living out loud had taught him what courage actually cost, and what it earned. His office now had color. Serafina's framed photo of her mother sat beside his computer, next to the succulent she'd rescued from her old desk. His all-gray wardrobe had acquired unexpected bursts of navy and deep green, chosen by hands that knew what looked good on him better than any stylist ever had. The silver clock still ticked, But it no longer sounded like a countdown to emptiness. His team had watched the transformation with varying degrees of shock. The war general who softened at the edges when she entered a room. The man who'd started leaving at 6 to have dinner with someone who made him laugh over pasta and cheap wine in restaurants that would horrify his mother's ghost. The board had raised eyebrows when he'd promoted Serafina to chief strategy officer. They'd stopped raising them when she'd doubled their market valuation in 8 months. But it wasn't the business success that made him pull the small velvet box from his pocket now. It was the way she'd taught him that rules could be rewritten. That fire wasn't something to fear, but something to hold close on cold nights. That curves weren't threats, but invitations to understand that beauty came in forms his narrow world had been too afraid to see. The door opened, and she stepped onto the deck wearing one of his shirts over her jeans, her hair caught in that messy bun she favored on weekends. No makeup, no armor, just Serafina, exactly as she was, which had always been more than enough. "Sorry about that," she said, moving into his arms like coming home. "Singapore investors wanted to marry me." The words came out rougher than he'd planned, without the speech he'd rehearsed, without any of the polish he'd once thought mattered. Just truth, raw and immediate, offered in the space between one breath and the next. She pulled back to look at him, and he saw everything in her eyes. Surprise, joy, that fire that had rewritten his entire existence. "You're serious." "I've spent 42 years being serious about all the wrong things." He opened the box, revealing the ring he'd chosen. Emerald surrounded by diamonds, bold and unapologetic. Nothing like the tasteful solitaire his mother would have approved. "I want to be serious about you, about us. About building a life that doesn't require either of us to shrink or hide or apologize for taking up space." Tears caught the sunset light on her cheeks. "You really have learned to breathe through storms." "You taught me." He touched her face, this woman who'd demolished his walls and showed him what lived on the other side of fear. "You taught me that forever isn't a plan or a rule or something you control. It's a promise. And I'm ready to make that promise, Serafina. If you'll have a man who took too long to realize that loving you was the bravest thing he'd ever do." She kissed him then, tasting of salt air and jasmine. And yes, yes, wrapped in fire and silk. Yes, that meant choosing each other over every rule that said they shouldn't fit. When she pulled back, she was smiling through tears. And the words she spoke rewrote his ending into a beginning. Yes. The ocean kept rolling. The sun kept setting. And two people who'd learned that some fires were meant to burn together stood barefoot on weathered wood, holding each other in the space where courage lived, where love demolished walls, where forever finally felt less like a prison and more like coming home. Some of us are Alistair, hiding behind rules that no longer serve us. Some of us are Serafina, waiting for someone to be brave enough to choose us fully. Which character did you see yourself in? Drop a comment below. And if you know someone who's been taught to fear the very thing they love, send them this story. If you enjoyed the story, hit the like button and subscribe for more stories like this. Your next favorite story might be just one click away.